I arrived at my childhood home for my 28th birthday celebration, expecting nothing more than the usual awkward family dinner. My sister Emma had brought her friend Ashley, which should have been my first warning sign. When Mom brought out the homemade chocolate cake, Dad immediately announced there wasn't enough for everyone, but somehow Ashley got a generous slice and went back for seconds. Emma got her piece. Mom and Dad served themselves. I stood there empty-handed watching this bizarre theater of favoritism play out like every other family gathering for the past 3 decades. Mom called me ungrateful when I grabbed my jacket. They said I was being dramatic. I didn't argue back or cause a scene. I simply paused at the threshold, looked back at my family enjoying my birthday cake without me, and stepped into the Detroit night air. The steering wheel felt cold under my grip as I drove through the quiet suburban streets of Dearborn. 28 years old, and they still treated me like an inconvenience at my own birthday party. The radio played some classic rock song, but I couldn't focus on the lyrics. My mind kept replaying the scene in the dining room, the way Ashley had smiled when Dad offered her seconds, the way Emma had avoided my eyes, the way Mom had shrugged like my presence was optional. I pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat in the silence for 10 minutes before walking inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as a tired waitress approached my booth. "What can I get you, honey?" "A slice of chocolate cake," I said. "Make it a big one." She brought me a corner piece with extra frosting, and I ate my own birthday cake alone in a vinyl booth while truckers and night shift workers moved through their routines around me. My phone buzzed constantly, 47 missed calls from various family members, but I let it ring. Each vibration felt like another attempt to drag me back into their version of normal, where I was always the afterthought. Growing up, it had been Emma who got the bigger bedroom when we moved houses. Emma who got the brand new bike while I inherited Dad's old 10-speed with the wobbly wheel. Emma whose college tuition got paid in full while I worked 3 jobs to cover my engineering degree. I'd told myself it was because she was younger, because she needed more help, because I was the strong one who could handle things on my own. But tonight, watching a stranger enjoy my birthday cake, while I was told there wasn't enough for me, something crystallized in my mind. This wasn't about cake. This wasn't about money or bikes or bedrooms. This was about my family's fundamental belief that I mattered less than everyone else in their orbit. I paid for my cake and walked back to my car. The drive to my apartment in Midtown Detroit took 20 minutes, long enough for me to cycle through anger, sadness, and finally a strange sense of clarity. As I pulled into my parking space, I noticed something unusual sitting by my front door. A package. Brown paper wrapping no return address, just my name written in careful handwriting I didn't recognize. I carried it upstairs along with the weight of the evening and set it on my kitchen counter. Inside were official-looking documents from a law firm inheritance paperwork that made no immediate sense. The letter on top was written in elegant cursive, Roosevelt. "I always knew you were the strong one. Don't let them take this too. All my love, Grandma Helen." I stared at the papers, my heart pounding. Grandma Helen had died 6 months ago, and we'd attended a small funeral service. But apparently she'd been planning something none of us knew about. According to these documents, she'd left me a house in Birmingham, a nice suburb 20 minutes north of Detroit, plus $150,000 in cash. But there was a condition that made my hands shake. As I read it, I couldn't tell my family about the inheritance for 6 months. The law office of Peterson and Associates occupied the 4th floor of a building in downtown Birmingham. Margaret Peterson, the estate attorney, was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Grandma Helen herself. "Your grandmother was very specific about her intentions," Margaret said, sliding a thick folder across her mahogany desk. She'd been documenting family dynamics for years. Inside the folder were photocopied letters, some dating back 15 years, all written in Grandma Helen's careful handwriting. Each letter described incidents she'd witnessed during family gatherings, birthday parties, where my achievements were overlooked, Christmas mornings where my gifts were noticeably smaller or cheaper, conversations where my parents discussed my future like I wasn't capable of making my own decisions. She was quite concerned about the pattern of treatment you received, Margaret continued. The house in Birmingham is fully paid off, and the cash inheritance is in a trust that releases to you in 6 months provided you maintain no contact with your family regarding the inheritance during that period. I flipped through photograph after photograph that Grandma Helen had taken over the years. Pictures of family dinners where I was seated at the far end of the table, holiday photos where everyone else was positioned in the center while I stood slightly apart. She'd been documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. Why 6 months? I asked. She believed you needed time to establish your independence without their interference. Your grandmother was quite explicit about her concerns regarding your family's potential reaction to your newfound financial stability. As I drove away from the law office with copies of all the paperwork, my phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and for some reason I answered. Roosevelt, where are you? We came by your work and they said you hadn't come in today. You went to my workplace. We're worried about you. The way you stormed out last night was completely inappropriate. Ashley felt terrible. Ashley felt terrible. Don't take that tone with me. Mom thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. We just want to help. I hung up and immediately called my supervisor at the automotive parts manufacturing company where I worked as a mechanical engineer. Daniel Rodriguez had been my boss for 3 years, and we'd always had a professional relationship built on mutual respect. Roosevelt, glad you called. I need to talk to you about something. Can you come in early tomorrow? Is everything okay? Let's discuss it in person. The next morning, Daniel closed his office door and gestured for me to sit down. His expression was serious, the kind that usually preceded discussions about budget cuts or restructuring. Your family came by yesterday, he said carefully, your father specifically. I'm sorry about that. I had no idea they would show up at my workplace. He seemed concerned about your mental state. Said you'd had some kind of violent episode at a family gathering and suggested we should keep an eye on you. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Violent episode. He mentioned anger management issues, unpredictable behavior. He seemed genuinely worried. But Roosevelt, in the 3 years you've worked here, you've never shown any signs of instability. Your work is consistently excellent. You get along well with everyone. You've never even raised your voice in a meeting. Because I don't have anger management issues. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying my face. I figured as much. But I had to ask. Is there something going on with your family that I should know about? For the first time in my adult life, I told someone outside my family the truth about how they treated me. Daniel listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his expression growing more serious, as I described years of being marginalized and dismissed. This isn't the first time they've contacted your workplace, is it? He asked when I finished. What do you mean? I made some calls yesterday after your father left. Your previous supervisor at Johnson Manufacturing mentioned that your father once called to warn them about your stability. Said you were going through some personal problems and might not be reliable. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My family hadn't just been undermining me at home. They'd been sabotaging my professional reputation for years. That weekend, I embarked on what I started thinking of as an investigation into my own life. If my family had been interfering with my career, what else had they been controlling without my knowledge? I started with my college friends. Jake Thompson had been my roommate for 2 years at Wayne State University, and we'd lost touch gradually after graduation. When I called him, his surprise at hearing from me was genuine. Roosevelt, man, it's been forever. How are you doing? I kept meaning to reach out, but your family always said you were going through problems and needed space. My family said what? Your sister called me a few times over the years, said you were dealing with some personal stuff and weren't really up for socializing. I figured you'd call when you were ready. I spent 3 hours on the phone with Jake, piecing together a pattern of interference that stretched back nearly a decade. Every time I'd tried to maintain friendships, my family had quietly discouraged people from contacting me. They'd positioned themselves as concerned relatives protecting my privacy while systematically isolating me from potential support systems. Next, I drove to my old neighborhood to visit the Johnsons, the family who'd lived next door during my teenage years. Mrs. Johnson answered the door with a warm smile, but I could see surprise in her eyes. "Roosevelt, what a lovely surprise. Come in, come in. How are you, dear?" We sat in their living room drinking coffee while Mr. Johnson joined us from his workshop in the garage. They were both retired now in their 70s, but their memories of our family dynamics were crystal clear. "We always thought your treatment was unfair," Mrs. Johnson said gently. "The way your parents favored Emma was quite obvious to anyone paying attention. You noticed, how could we not? You were such a polite, hard-working boy, but you always seemed to be apologizing for taking up space. We used to talk about it wondering if we should say something, but you know how it is with family matters." Mr. Johnson leaned forward in his recliner. "Your father used to complain about you to other neighbors, said you were difficult, ungrateful. But we watched you mow their lawn every week, saw you shoveling their driveway before school in the winter, helping your mother carry groceries. You were the most helpful kid on the block." They told me about conversations they'd overheard times when my parents had discussed my future, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a son to be supported. Mrs. Johnson mentioned seeing my mail delivered to their house by mistake several times, and how my mother had always been quick to collect it personally rather than letting me know it had been misdelivered. "Your mail?" I asked. "Oh yes, happened quite often. College acceptance letters, job-related correspondence. Your mother always said she'd make sure you got it." A cold realization settled in my stomach. I drove straight to the post office and filed a formal complaint about mail theft, requesting an investigation into any forwarding or interception services that might have been set up on my address without my knowledge. The postal inspector, a serious woman named Carol Washington, explained that mail theft was a federal crime, but proving it would require evidence of specific incidents. She suggested I set up a post office box and start monitoring my mail delivery more carefully. That evening, I called my current coworker, Brian Stevens, who'd become something of a friend over the past year. We occasionally grabbed beers after work, and I trusted his perspective on workplace dynamics. "Brian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Shoot. Has anyone from my family ever contacted you about me?" There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Your father called me about 6 months ago. Said you were going through a difficult time and might seem withdrawn at work. Asked me to keep an eye on you and let him know if you seemed unstable." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you seemed fine to me. But honestly, Roosevelt, it made me wonder if there was something going on with you that I wasn't seeing. I've been watching you more carefully since then, looking for signs of problems." The manipulation was so thorough, so systematic, that I felt dizzy, trying to comprehend its scope. They'd been controlling my narrative with friends, neighbors, co-workers, and probably complete strangers, positioning themselves as the concerned family of a troubled man, while systematically undermining every aspect of my independence. But the worst discovery came when I called Margaret Peterson, the estate attorney, with a question about the inheritance timeline. She mentioned almost in passing that my parents had tried to contact her office 2 weeks after Grandma Helen's funeral. They wanted to know about the will, she said. Seemed surprised when I told them I couldn't discuss the details with anyone except the named beneficiaries. They knew about the inheritance. They seemed to know something was coming your way. Your father was quite insistent that I discuss your mental fitness to handle financial responsibility. Said the family had concerns about your judgment. I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy I was only beginning to understand. My family hadn't just been treating me as an afterthought. They'd been actively working to control and isolate me, positioning themselves as my caretakers while systematically undermining my autonomy. and somehow they'd known about Grandma Helen's inheritance before I did. I decided to confront them directly, but not in the way they expected. 3 days after my conversation with Margaret Peterson, I showed up at my parents' house during one of Emma's dinner parties. She hosted these gatherings monthly, inviting neighbors and family friends to elaborate meals that showcased her cooking skills and social connections. The timing was deliberate. I wanted witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Mom answered the door with a surprised smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Roosevelt, what a wonderful surprise. Come in, we're just finishing dinner." The dining room was full of familiar faces, the Kowalskis from down the street, Emma's friend Ashley, my parents' longtime friends, the Brennans, and several people I recognized but couldn't name. Everyone turned toward me with polite curiosity as I entered. "Roosevelt," Dad said, standing up from his seat at the head of the table. "We've been worried about you. You disappeared after the party, and then you missed work. Daniel Rodriguez called to check on you." I felt the attention of the room focus on me like a spotlight. This was their strategy public performance of concern making me look unstable if I reacted with anything other than grateful acceptance of their worry. "I didn't miss work," I said calmly. "I spoke with Daniel and everything is fine." Emma stood up, moving toward me with what looked like genuine concern. "Roosevelt, we know you've been under a lot of stress lately. We just want to help." "What stress would that be?" "You've been withdrawn angry. The way you acted at your birthday party was completely out of character." Mrs. Kowalski, a woman in her 70s who'd known our family for decades, looked between us with obvious confusion. "What happened at the birthday party?" Emma and my parents exchanged glances, and I could see them recalibrating their approach. They'd expected me to either explode in anger or slink away in shame. My calm questioning was disrupting their narrative. "There was an incident with the birthday cake," Mom said carefully. "Roosevelt had an outburst when we didn't have enough servings for everyone." "An outburst?" I asked. "You stormed out of the house," Dad added, slammed the door, refused to discuss the situation like an adult. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, making sure the screen was visible to several people at the table. "Would you mind repeating that? I'd like to make sure I understand your version of events." The room went quiet. Dad's face flushed slightly and Emma took a step back. "Why are you recording us?" Mom asked. "Because I've learned some interesting things about how this family operates, and I want to make sure I have accurate records of our conversations." Mr. Brennan, a retired attorney who'd known my parents for 20 years, leaned forward in his chair. "Roosevelt, is everything all right? You seem quite serious." "I'm fine, Mr. Brennan, but I've discovered that my family has been contacting my employer's friends and neighbors to suggest that I'm mentally unstable. I'm trying to understand why they would do that." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see my parents' carefully constructed public image cracking in real time. "That's not true," Emma said quickly. "We've never done anything like that." "Really, because Daniel Rodriguez told me that Dad visited my workplace to warn them about my violent tendencies. Jake Thompson told me that Emma called him to say I was going through problems and needed space. My previous supervisor at Johnson Manufacturing received similar warnings. Should I continue?" Dad stood up straighter, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood. "We were concerned about you. We had every right to reach out to people in your life when we noticed troubling behavior." "What troubling behavior would that be?" "Your withdrawal from the family, your apparent anger issues, your inability to handle normal social situations without causing drama." I looked around the room at the faces watching us. Some showed concern, others confusion, but I could see several people beginning to realize they were witnessing something more complex than a simple family disagreement. "So to be clear," I said, still recording, "you believe I have anger issues?" "We're worried about you," Mom said. "And you think I'm mentally unstable?" "We think you might benefit from professional help," Emma added. I nodded slowly. "And you've been sharing these concerns with my employer's friends and neighbors without my knowledge or consent?" The trap was set. They'd admitted to exactly what I'd accused them of on recording in front of witnesses. But then Emma did something that shocked me more than any revelation I'd uncovered in my investigation. She pulled out a small leather journal from her purse. "Since you want to talk about evidence," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I've been documenting your concerning behaviors for months. Mood swings, paranoid thinking, social isolation. I have dates, times, specific incidents." She opened the journal and began reading entries that painted me as gradually becoming more unstable, more isolated, more prone to angry outbursts. The entries were detailed, specific, and completely fabricated. But as she read, I noticed something interesting. Several of the incidents she described had occurred on dates when I had verifiable alibis, work meetings, documented timestamps, witnesses to my actual whereabouts. And then she made the mistake I'd been hoping for. "Just last week you called me ranting about some imaginary inheritance from Grandma Helen. You said you were coming into money and that we'd all be sorry for how we treated you." I stopped the recording and smiled. "Emma, I never told you about any inheritance from Grandma Helen." Her face went pale, the room was completely silent. "But you just said I called you ranting about it. How would you know about an inheritance that I never mentioned to you?" The journal entry about the imaginary inheritance was the thread that unraveled everything. If Emma had been documenting my supposed delusions about coming into money, but I had never told my family about Grandma Helen's will, then either Emma was psychic or my family had access to information they shouldn't have had. I spent the next week approaching the situation with the same methodical precision I used in my engineering work. Every problem had a solution if you broke it down into component parts and analyzed the data systematically. My first stop was the Postal Inspector Carol Washington. I filed a formal complaint alleging mail theft and provided her with Emma's journal entries about the inheritance as evidence that someone in my family had been accessing my correspondence. "This is actually quite helpful," Carol said, reviewing Emma's handwriting. "If she documented your supposed delusions about inheritance money, but you never discussed inheritance money with your family, then she had to learn about it from another source. Could you investigate my mail delivery? We can look into it. Mail theft is a federal crime, and if we can prove systematic interception of your correspondence, that's a serious matter." Next, I contacted Marcus Williams, my college roommate who'd graduated from law school 5 years earlier and now worked for a mid-sized firm in Troy. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, and I trusted him to give me honest legal advice. "Roosevelt, man, what you're describing sounds like harassment, mail theft, possibly fraud. If they've been interfering with your employment by making false statements about your mental health, that could be defamation." We met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Royal Oak, and I showed him copies of Emma's journal transcripts of my recorded conversations and documentation from the postal inspector's investigation. "The inheritance situation is particularly interesting," Marcus said, reviewing the papers. "If your family tried to contest the will or interfere with the estate before you even knew about it, that suggests they were monitoring your grandmother's affairs, possibly your mail or both. What are my options? Legally, you have several avenues. Practically, you need to decide what you want to accomplish. Do you want to punish them, or do you want them to stop interfering with your life?" I thought about the question for several minutes, watching traffic move through the intersection outside the restaurant window. What did I want? Justice, revenge, understanding? Or simply the freedom to live my life without their manipulation and control? "I want them to acknowledge what they've done and stop doing it," I said finally. "But I also want to protect myself from future interference." Marcus nodded. "Then we need to build a comprehensive case that gives you leverage. Evidence that they can't deny witnesses, they can't discredit documentation, that establishes a clear pattern of behavior." Over the following days, I systematically gathered evidence with Marcus's guidance. We obtained my employment records from both current and previous jobs, documenting the dates when my family members had contacted my supervisors. We interviewed Jake Thompson and several other college friends who'd been contacted by Emma or my parents over the years. We collected witness statements from neighbors who'd observed the preferential treatment Emma received throughout our childhood. The postal inspector's investigation revealed that someone had been intercepting my mail by filing change of address forms and then canceling them after collecting my correspondence. The forms had been filed using my personal information, but the handwriting analysis matched samples of Emma's writing from her journal. But the most damaging discovery came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly neighbor who'd witnessed my childhood treatment, mentioned that she'd overheard my parents talking on their back patio the previous month. "I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally," she said, "but sound carries especially in the evening when it's quiet. Your father was on the phone with someone discussing plans to have you declared mentally incompetent. He mentioned something about inheritance money and protecting family assets from your poor judgment." "Did you hear him mention any specific details?" "He said something about a psychiatrist who owed him a favor. Said they could manufacture a mental health crisis if necessary. I felt cold despite the warm afternoon sunshine." "Would you be willing to provide a written statement about what you heard?" "Of course, dear. I've always thought your treatment was unfair, and if they're planning something harmful, people should know about it." Marcus helped me understand the legal implications of what Mrs. Johnson had overheard. If my family was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent through fraudulent means that constituted conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly elder abuse, if they were targeting inheritance money, and definitely conspiracy to violate my civil rights. "The timing is particularly suspicious," Marcus explained. "If they were planning this action right after your birthday, using your supposed reaction to the cake incident as evidence of instability, then the entire birthday party was likely a setup." "A setup?" "Think about it. They invite you over, create a situation guaranteed to upset you, then document your reaction as evidence of mental instability. If you'd reacted more dramatically, stormed out, angrily shouted at them, they could have used that as justification for their next steps." The realization was disturbing but also clarifying. Every interaction with my family for years had been performance and manipulation designed to control my narrative and limit my options. They'd been building a case against my competency while systematically isolating me from support systems that might help me fight back. But in their arrogance, they'd made mistakes. Emma's journal contained fabricated entries that could be disproven with documentation. They'd contacted too many people with their false concerns, creating a trail of witnesses to their interference. And they'd underestimated my ability to methodically gather evidence and build a counter-narrative. Margaret Peterson, the estate attorney, provided the final piece of the puzzle. At my request, she reviewed her office's phone logs and discovered that my father had called her office 6 times in the 2 weeks following Grandma Helen's funeral, trying to get information about the will. He'd claimed to be concerned about my mental fitness to handle inheritance money, and had asked about procedures for challenging the will on grounds of the beneficiary's incompetence. "He was quite persistent," Margaret said, "and quite specific about his concerns regarding your mental state. It was unusual enough that I made detailed notes of our conversations. With Marcus's help, I compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier documented mail theft, employment, interference, witness statements, recorded admissions, evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, and a clear pattern of manipulation and control spanning years. But more importantly, I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just family dysfunction or favoritism. This was a systematic campaign to control my life, my finances, my relationships, and my autonomy. They'd been treating me not as a family member, but as a problem to be managed. And they'd been planning to escalate their control by having me declared legally incompetent using fabricated evidence and corrupt medical professionals. I planned the confrontation with the same precision I'd used to design a mechanical system. Every component had to work together. Every variable had to be accounted for, and the outcome had to be decisive. Marcus helped me understand the legal framework for what I was about to do. "You're essentially offering them a choice," he explained. They can acknowledge their behavior and accept your terms for reconciliation, or they can face legal consequences for their actions. But you need to be prepared for either outcome. I sent Emma a text message on a Thursday afternoon. I'd like to organize a family gathering this weekend to apologize for my behavior at the birthday party. I realize I overreacted and I want to make things right. Can you arrange for Saturday evening at Mom and Dad's house? Her response came within minutes. Of course, I'm so glad you're ready to work things out. I'll invite the same people from the dinner party so you can apologize to them too. Perfect, I needed witnesses for what was about to happen. I spent Friday evening preparing 3 identical portfolios, each containing copies of all the evidence Marcus and I had gathered. Employment interference documentation, witness statements, mail theft evidence, Emma's fabricated journal entries, recordings of their admissions, and Mrs. Johnson's statement about overhearing their conspiracy plans. Saturday arrived clear and warm, one of those perfect Michigan summer evenings that made you remember why people chose to live in the Midwest despite the harsh winters. I drove to my childhood home with Marcus following in his car, posing as a longtime friend who'd asked to join the gathering. The same crowd from Emma's dinner party was there: the Kowalskis, the Brennans, Ashley, and several other neighbors and family friends. Emma had prepared an elaborate meal, and everyone seemed genuinely pleased that I'd decided to apologize and reconcile with my family. After dinner, I stood up and asked for everyone's attention. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, I began. I asked Emma to invite you because you witnessed my behavior last weekend, and I felt you deserved to hear my response to the concerns my family has raised about my mental health and stability. Dad smiled encouragingly, probably expecting a humble admission of my problems and gratitude for their intervention. Over the past week, I've done a lot of reflection and investigation into my family's concerns about my behavior, and I've brought some documentation that I think will help everyone understand the situation more clearly. I pulled out the 3 portfolios and handed one to Mr. Brennan, one to Mrs. Kowalski, and kept the third for myself. These portfolios contain evidence of a systematic campaign by my family to interfere with my employment relationships and personal autonomy over the past several years. The documents include recorded admissions, witness statements, and evidence of federal crimes, including mail theft. The room went completely silent. Dad started to stand up, but I continued speaking. Emma, you documented in your journal that I called you ranting about an imaginary inheritance from Grandma Helen, but I never told you about any inheritance. How did you know about inheritance money that existed only in my supposed delusions? Emma's face went white. Roosevelt, you're being paranoid again. The portfolios contain postal inspector documentation proving that someone has been intercepting my mail using forged change of address forms. The handwriting analysis matches samples of Emma's writing. I opened my portfolio to a specific page. They also contain witness statements from neighbors who overheard Dad planning to have me declared mentally incompetent using fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Mrs. Johnson, who lives next door, heard him discussing these plans with someone on the phone. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd been flipping through her portfolio, looked up with shock. This says your family contacted your employers to warn them about violent tendencies and mental instability. That's correct, multiple employers over several years. The documentation shows a clear pattern of interference designed to isolate me and control my narrative. Mr. Brennan, using his legal background, was reading more carefully. Roosevelt, if this documentation is accurate, your family has committed several serious crimes. I'm aware of that, Mr. Brennan, which is why I wanted all of you to witness my response. I turned to face my parents and Emma directly. You have a choice. You can acknowledge what you've done, seek therapy to address the toxic patterns in this family system, and accept strict boundaries regarding future contact with my employer's friends and personal affairs. Or I can file criminal charges for mail theft, civil suits for employment interference and defamation, and fraud charges related to your plans for fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Dad's face was red with anger. You ungrateful little... Dad, everyone in this room now has copies of evidence documenting years of your interference with my life. Whatever you say next will be heard by witnesses who can verify that you've been lying about my mental state while systematically sabotaging my independence. Emma suddenly broke down crying. But instead of the manipulative tears I'd seen before, these seemed different. Raw, desperate, genuine. I can't do this anymore, she sobbed. I hate what we've become. I hate what I've done to you. She looked around the room at the shocked faces of our neighbors and family friends, then back at me. You want to know the truth? They made me write those journal entries. They made me call your friends and employers. They threatened to cut me off financially if I didn't help them control you. Mom reached for Emma's arm. Emma, don't... No, Mom. I'm done. Roosevelt, they've been using the same tactics on me for years. Threatening to disown me if I didn't help them manage you. Making me feel guilty for having a relationship with you that they couldn't control. I've been miserable, and I made you miserable, and I can't live with it anymore. She turned to face our parents. I'm 26 years old, and I've never made a decision without worrying about whether you'd cut me off. I've never had a relationship you didn't approve of, never taken a job you didn't choose, never even bought a car without your permission. And you made me help you do the same thing to Roosevelt. The room was completely silent except for Emma's crying and the sound of pages turning as people continued reading through the portfolios. Mrs. Kowalski closed her portfolio and looked at my parents with disgust. I've known your family for 15 years, and I never imagined you were capable of this kind of manipulation. Mr. Brennan stood up. I think my wife and I should leave. This is clearly a family matter that requires professional intervention. As the neighbors and friends filed out, each taking their copy of the evidence with them, my parents sat in their dining room chairs, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen them. What do you want? Dad asked quietly. I want you to acknowledge that what you've done is wrong. I want you to commit to family therapy to address these toxic patterns. And I want your agreement that you will never again contact my employers, friends, neighbors, or anyone else in my life without my explicit permission. And if we don't agree, Mom asked, then Monday morning, Marcus files criminal charges for mail theft, civil suits, for defamation and employment interference, and fraud charges related to your conspiracy to have me declared incompetent. The evidence is comprehensive. The witnesses are credible, and you've admitted to much of it on recording. Emma wiped her eyes and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. I want to do better, she said. I want to learn how to have a real relationship with you, not one based on manipulation and control. Will you help me? For the first time in my adult life, I saw my family as they really were: damaged people who'd created a system of control and manipulation because they were terrified of losing influence over their children's lives. But Emma's breakdown had shown me something important. They were as trapped in this toxic pattern as I was. I'll help you, I told Emma. But it starts with all of us getting professional help to learn how to relate to each other in healthy ways. Dad looked around the empty dining room, probably calculating the social cost of having their manipulation exposed to the entire neighborhood. What kind of therapy? He asked finally. Family therapy, individual therapy for each of us, and a commitment to rebuilding relationships based on respect instead of control. Mom nodded slowly. And the criminal charges, if you commit to therapy and honor the boundaries about not interfering with my life, I won't file charges. But Marcus will keep all the evidence, and any future interference will result in immediate legal action. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined. There were no shouting matches, no storming out, no final declarations of independence, just a quiet acknowledgement that our family system was broken and needed professional help to heal. But as I drove home that night with Marcus following behind me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the possibility of having a real family relationship based on mutual respect, instead of manipulation and control. 6 months later, I hosted my 29th birthday celebration in the backyard of my inherited house in Birmingham. The property was everything Grandma Helen's letters had promised: a small but well-maintained colonial with mature oak trees, a vegetable garden she'd tended for decades, and enough space for the kind of gathering I'd never been able to imagine hosting before. The guest list was carefully curated. Marcus and his wife, Jennifer Jake Thompson, and two other college friends I'd reconnected with: the Johnsons, from my old neighborhood, Daniel Rodriguez and his family, Brian Stevens from work, and Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher I'd been dating for 3 months. Sarah had insisted on making the birthday cake herself, a layered chocolate creation with enough generous slices for everyone plus leftovers. She'd listened to the story of my previous birthday with the kind of quiet empathy that made me understand why children trusted her with their fears and hopes. "There's something deeply satisfying about making sure everyone gets cake," she'd said while frosting the layers. "It's such a simple thing, but it says so much about how we value the people in our lives." Emma arrived precisely at the time I'd specified, carrying a small wrapped gift and wearing an expression of nervous hope I was still getting used to seeing on her face. The 6 months of family therapy had been difficult for both of us, but particularly challenging for her as she worked to separate her own desires and opinions from our parents' expectations. "The house is beautiful," she said, looking around the backyard with genuine appreciation. "Grandma Helen would be so happy to see you here. She would have loved watching you learn to make your own decisions," I replied. Emma's transformation had been the most surprising aspect of our family's healing process. Without the constant pressure to manage and control me on our parents' behalf, she'd begun developing her own identity for the first time in her adult life. She'd moved into her own apartment, started dating a social worker named Michael, who valued her kindness over her compliance, and enrolled in a master's program in counseling psychology. "I think I want to help other families learn healthier ways of relating to each other," she'd explained during one of our monthly sibling dinners. "I understand now how much damage we can do to people we love when we try to control them instead of supporting them." Mom and Dad arrived together, but the dynamic between them had shifted significantly. Individual therapy had helped Dad recognize that his need to control others stemmed from his own fear of abandonment and inadequacy. Mom had discovered that her enabling behavior was rooted in a terror of conflict that had led her to sacrifice her children's well-being for the illusion of family harmony. They were still married, but they were learning to relate to each other and to their children as separate individuals rather than extensions of their own needs and fears. "Happy birthday, son," Dad said, handing me a card that I knew contained words he'd written himself rather than sentiments chosen from a store display. The family therapy sessions had included exercises in authentic communication, and his birthday messages had evolved from generic platitudes to personal reflections on our relationship. "Thank you for giving us the chance to learn how to be a real family." Mom added, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. The conversation flowed naturally as my guests mingled in the golden light of late afternoon. Jake regaled everyone with stories from our college engineering projects, while the Johnsons shared memories of watching me grow up in their old neighborhood. Daniel and Brian talked shop about automotive manufacturing, and Sarah engaged Emma in a thoughtful discussion about child development and family systems. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing the gathering with a sense of profound gratitude that went beyond simple happiness. These were people who valued my presence not because of what I could do for them or how I reflected on their reputation, but because they genuinely enjoyed my company and respected my perspective. Margaret Peterson, the estate attorney, had explained in our final meeting that Grandma Helen had structured the inheritance with remarkable wisdom. The 6-month delay had given me time to establish my independence and build evidence against my family's manipulation before they could interfere with my newfound financial stability. But more importantly, it had created space for authentic healing to begin. Your grandmother understood that sometimes people need consequences to recognize the need for change, Margaret had said. But she also believed in the possibility of redemption if people were willing to do the hard work of transformation. The evening's highlight came when I gathered everyone together for the cake ceremony. Sarah had created 29 individual candles arranged in a spiral pattern, and as I prepared to blow them out, I looked around at faces illuminated by candlelight and felt a deep sense of completion. Before I make my wish, I said, I want to thank all of you for helping me understand what real family means. Not the family you're born into necessarily, but the people who choose to support your growth and celebrate your happiness. Emma wiped tears from her eyes, and I could see Dad struggling to maintain his composure. Mom reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand in a gesture of gratitude for the kindness she'd shown me. I closed my eyes and made my wish not for revenge against people who'd hurt me, not for protection against future challenges, but for continued growth in my ability to recognize and nurture healthy relationships. The cake was perfect with enough slices for everyone and plenty of leftovers to send home with guests. As people began to leave, each carrying containers of cake and warm wishes for the year ahead, I reflected on the lessons this journey had taught me. Grandma Helen's final letter, which I'd found tucked inside her recipe box in the kitchen, had explained her philosophy about family relationships. Real love doesn't try to control or diminish the people we care about. Real love creates space for others to become their authentic selves, even when that means they might make choices we wouldn't make for them. She'd recognized the toxic patterns in our family system decades before anyone else was willing to acknowledge them. But rather than simply cutting ties or enabling the dysfunction to continue, she'd created a pathway for healing that honored both accountability and the possibility of redemption. The legal consequences my family had faced were minimal in practical terms. No criminal charges were filed, no civil suits were pursued, no financial penalties were imposed. But the social consequences of having their manipulation exposed to neighbors and friends had created sufficient motivation for genuine change. Most importantly, the therapy process had revealed that none of us had been truly happy in our old family system. Emma had been as trapped by the expectations placed on her as I had been by the marginalization I'd experienced. Mom and Dad had been living in constant fear of losing control over their children's lives, never able to simply enjoy our company or take pride in our independence. 6 months later, we were all different people. Emma was building a career based on her own interests and values. Mom had returned to the art classes she'd abandoned when we were children, reconnecting with her own creativity and identity. Dad had started volunteering with a youth mentorship program, learning to support young people's growth without trying to control their choices. And I had learned to trust my own judgment, set healthy boundaries, and recognize the difference between people who wanted to support me and people who wanted to control me. As Sarah and I cleaned up the last of the party debris, she asked the question that had been building between us for weeks. "What happens next?" she said. "Now that you've rebuilt your relationship with your family and established your independence, what do you want to focus on?" I looked around the backyard that Grandma Helen had tended for decades now, illuminated by string lights I'd hung between the oak trees. The house felt like home in a way that no place ever had before. But more than that, my life felt like my own. "I want to keep growing," I said. "I want to build something meaningful with someone who values authenticity over control. I want to use what I've learned to help other people recognize manipulation and find their own paths to independence." Sarah smiled, and I could see in her expression the kind of partnership I'd never known was possible, two whole people choosing to support each other's growth rather than trying to complete or control each other. The story that had begun with a birthday cake and a moment of quiet dignity had evolved into something far more significant, a blueprint for transforming toxic family patterns into healthy relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. As we turned off the lights and headed inside, I thought about Grandma Helen's belief that love should create space for people to become their authentic selves. It had taken 29 years and a carefully orchestrated confrontation with manipulation and control, but I finally understood what she meant. Real family isn't about blood relations or shared history. Real family is about people who celebrate your growth, support your dreams, and value your presence in their lives. And sometimes, if you're incredibly fortunate, the people you're related to can learn to become that kind of family too. The lesson I'd learned went beyond family dynamics to something fundamental about human relationships. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. For years, I'd accepted marginalization, manipulation, and control because I believed that was the price of maintaining family connections. But Grandma Helen had shown me a different path. Sometimes love requires you to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their behavior and give them the opportunity to change. And sometimes if you're patient and strong enough to maintain your boundaries while offering a path to redemption, toxic patterns can be transformed into healthy relationships that honor everyone's dignity and potential. That's the birthday gift Grandma Helen really gave me, not just financial independence, but the understanding that I deserve to be treated with respect and the tools to create that reality for myself. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you were constantly marginalized or manipulated? How did you recognize the patterns? And what steps did you take to establish healthier boundaries? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing for more content about building authentic relationships and overcoming family dysfunction. Sharing stories like this can help others recognize that they're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics, and that change is possible with patience, courage, and the right support system. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I hope the lessons I learned might offer some guidance for your own path toward healthier relationships and authentic self-expression.